What you are about to hear is not a pious legend. It is not a tale created to comfort fragile hearts. It is a testimony I heard from real people, marked by tears, silence, and disbelief. A narrative that began when faith had already completely run out. There are stories I hesitated to tell, not because there was a lack of evidence, but because they challenge even those who have seen much. After more than 20 years dedicating my life to traveling through cities, forgotten churches, silent hospitals, and almost abandoned cemeteries, I learned one thing. The deepest miracles do not begin with faith. They begin with pain, with revolt, with questions that no one dares to voice aloud. My name is Jose Rodriguez. I am devoted to the Virgin Mary, and it was this devotion that led me to cross places where hope seemed to have died, only to find stories that insisted on remaining alive. That's how I came to know the story of Miguel. Miguel was not an extraordinary man. On the contrary, his life was always simple, hard, silent. He worked as a gravedigger in Mexico City. He spent his days burying stories, goodbyes, and promises that would never be fulfilled. For him, death had become routine. There was a time when Miguel believed in God. He believed firmly. This faith came from his mother, a deeply devoted woman who never ceased to pray, even when her body no longer obeyed. But illness arrived without warning. It advanced quickly and took his mother away. From that day on, something inside Miguel died along with her. He began to question everything, the prayers that went unanswered, the silence that followed, the feeling of abandonment. The faith that once sustained him began to seem like a comfortable lie. And little by little, he stopped believing. As if that weren't enough, life decided to repeat the pain. The same rare, cruel, and unexplained disease struck his daughter Sarah, a girl of only 7 years, a strange illness that attacked the blood and robbed the body of strength. Sarah stopped running, then she stopped walking, then she almost stopped smiling. The doctors tried everything. They examined, they discussed, they researched, until they reached the only possible conclusion: there was no treatment, there was no cure. Nothing more could be done. The guidance was direct, cold, and devastating. Take the child home and make her last days more comfortable. It was there that Miguel's faith turned into revolt. While he angrily asserted that God did not exist, his wife, Carmen, clung to prayer as if refusing to sink. The house became a battlefield. Harsh words, long silences, a marriage tested by the limits of pain. And on a seemingly ordinary morning, Miguel would take an unthinkable action, an act of anger. A challenge thrown not just against God, but against everything he still did not understand. At that moment he did not know, but the impossible had already begun to move. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. Write in the comments the time and city from where you are listening to this testimony. I want to know how far this story reaches. Also, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now let me continue from where I left off. Miguel began to live on autopilot. That's how he described those days. He woke up, worked, came home, all without feeling anything, as if he were merely passing through time while waiting for the worst to happen. Sarah's condition worsened rapidly. The girl no longer had the strength to stand. Her fragile body seemed to be fighting against something invisible, something no one could explain. The nights were long, marked by groans of pain and the constant fear that this might be the last dawn. Carmen did not give up. Even exhausted, she remained firm in faith. Every morning she knelt by her daughter's bed holding a simple, worn blue rosary. She prayed silently, with tears streaming down her face, asking for what the doctors had already denied. It was on one of those mornings that everything worsened. Miguel woke up and found his wife kneeling, as always. But on that day, something inside him exploded. The revolt, stored for weeks, came to the surface violently. He shouted. He said words he never imagined he would say. He claimed that God did not exist, that faith saved no one, that if there were any divine power, his mother would not have died, and his daughter would not be in that condition. In a fit of rage, he snatched the rosary from Carmen's hands and threw it in the trash. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Carmen cried. Miguel left the house without looking back. But according to what he told me, something strange happened in that moment. Even trying to convince himself otherwise, he felt a tightness in his chest, an unsettling feeling that was hard to explain, as if, despite all the anger, something insisted on remaining. The work that day was especially heavy. Miguel was working in a large cemetery in the city. There were no shortages of burials, the sound of shovels, the smell of earth, the respectful silence of goodbyes. All of that was part of the routine. But that day, he couldn't shake thoughts of his daughter, his mother, the blue rosary thrown away. At the end of the shift, when his body could take no more, the supervisor called him. There was a burial scheduled for early the next morning. The grave needed to be opened that day. There was no option. Miguel accepted without arguing. He said that, at that point, nothing else made a difference. The designated area was close to an old chapel, now closed, forgotten by time. A silent place, rarely visited, where the wind seemed to carry ancient stories. Miguel began to dig. The earth was hard, compact, resistant. Each blow of the tool required an effort he barely had. The fatigue was physical, but the greater weight came from within. It was then that the blade hit something different. It was not stone, not a root. Miguel stopped. He knelt and began to remove the earth with his hands. That's when his fingers touched a fabric, a white handkerchief. His heart raced. That made no sense. The spot had never received a grave. There shouldn't have been anything in that patch of earth. Carefully, Miguel opened the cloth, and as he did, he felt the air around him change. Inside the handkerchief lay a host, white, whole, perfect, without signs of deterioration, without marks of time. Miguel knew exactly what he was seeing, and at that moment something began to happen, something he was not yet ready to accept. Before continuing, if you've made it this far, show your faith in the comments, write Blue Rosary, so I'll know that you believe and have faith in the Virgin Mary. Well, now let me continue the testimony. Miguel told me that he remained still for a few seconds, kneeling before the open ground, holding the cloth with the host as if afraid to breathe. He knew what it was, he knew what it meant, and yet his mind was trying to find a logical explanation, anything that would free him from that direct confrontation with the sacred. It was at that moment that he felt it. A soft, unexpected fragrance filled the air around him. It did not come from flowers. There were no crowns or arrangements nearby. It was a delicate, sweet aroma, impossible to ignore. Miguel looked around, confused, feeling his heart race. This made no sense at all. Even so, he resisted. Carefully, he folded the cloth, placed the host inside, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He finished the work as best as he could, closing the grave, cleaning the tools, trying to act as if nothing had happened. But inside, something had been deeply shaken. When he got home, he told everything to Carmen. She listened in silence. Her eyes filled with tears even before Miguel finished his account. For her, there was no doubt. This was a sign, an answer, a presence that had never abandoned them. Miguel reacted poorly. He said it was a coincidence, that it meant nothing. He ordered her never to speak of God in that house again. In a cold gesture, he placed the cloth with the host on the coffee table and went to sleep, leaving behind a heavy, almost suffocating silence. That night was different from all the others. Miguel couldn't rest. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by confusing dreams, disjointed images, sensations hard to explain. Until at a certain moment, everything became clear. He found himself in front of a woman. She was dressed in shades of blue and white. Her gaze was neither severe nor threatening. It was serene, firm. Her presence filled the room without needing harsh words. When she spoke, her voice was soft but heavy with authority. The body and blood of Christ save, believe, trust. Miguel tried to respond but couldn't. Before he could say anything, the figure disappeared. The emptiness left behind was filled with a strange feeling, a mix of fear and peace. He woke up startled. Almost at the same instant, he heard screams coming from his daughter's room. Sarah was in crisis. She cried out in pain, writhing on the bed, weak, exhausted. Carmen was desperate. There was something in her face that Miguel would never forget. The fear of a mother who feels she is losing her daughter. Miguel ran. As he crossed the living room, he felt that fragrance again, the same aroma he had sensed at the cemetery. His whole body shivered. He stopped for a second and looked at the coffee table. The white cloth was there. On it, the host lay untouched. But now there was something more. A soft, almost imperceptible glow highlighted it in the dark room. It was not ordinary light. It was different, serene, alive. Miguel remembered the words from the dream, "The body and blood of Christ save. Believe. Trust." At that moment, the resistance fell. Without saying anything, he took the host, walked to his daughter's room, and did something that would change everything. Miguel entered Sarah's room with steps that seemed to barely touch the ground. Carmen watched him, not understanding, with tear-filled eyes and a heart in despair. The girl cried softly, exhausted, as if she no longer had the strength to ask for help. The air in the room was heavy, charged with fear. He approached the bed. For a moment, Miguel hesitated. Everything he had denied, everything he had said, all the harsh words thrown at God, now seemed to silently watch him. But the fragrance was still there, and the words from the dream echoed within him with a clarity impossible to ignore. The body and blood of Christ save. No speeches, no explanations. Miguel simply leaned down, asked Sarah to open her mouth, and carefully placed the host inside. Carmen brought her hand to her chest. She said nothing. She just trusted. The girl swallowed slowly. Her eyes closed. Her breathing began to slow. The crisis ceased. Little by little, the crying gave way to silence, a deep, different silence. Sarah fell asleep as she hadn't in weeks, a heavy, peaceful, almost restorative sleep. Miguel and Carmen looked at each other, not knowing what to say. The fear was still there, but something new was beginning to be born. They also slept. The next morning, a noise in the living room woke the couple. It was not a groan, it was not a cry for help. It was laughter, a sound forgotten in that house. Miguel got up with his heart racing, imagining the worst. He walked slowly to the living room, prepared for anything, and that's when he saw it. Sarah was standing, running, jumping, playing like any healthy child. Her face lit up with pure joy impossible to fake. Upon seeing her parents, she ran and hugged them tightly. Miguel fell to his knees. Carmen cried without being able to speak. The girl smiled and said something that would never leave their memory. "Daddy, it was God and the Virgin Mary. I saw them, they spoke to me, and she gave me a gift." In Sarah's hands was a blue rosary, the same rosary that Miguel had thrown in the trash. There was no way to explain it. There were no words, just tears, gratitude, and a silence full of presence. That same day, they took Sarah to the hospital. The doctor who had been following her examined her, repeated tests, ordered new exams. The disbelief filled the room. There were no more signs of the disease. The blood was normal. The symptoms had disappeared. What was once considered incurable simply no longer existed. The doctor confirmed, unable to hide his astonishment, Sarah was cured. Miguel told me that from that day on, his life changed. He began to smile again. He started to pray again. And he never passed by the old chapel in the cemetery without stopping. He always leaves a flower. He always says a prayer. Because he learned in the hardest and most beautiful way possible that even when faith fades away, God remains. When I finished listening to Miguel's account, I remained silent for a few minutes, not because I lacked words, but because certain stories do not call for immediate comments. They call for respect. They call for listening. They ask us to allow something within us to be touched as well. Throughout all these years wandering the world, I have learned that faith rarely returns through the door of logic. It usually comes back through the paths we least expect, sometimes through an unthoughtful gesture, sometimes through unbearable pain, and in rare moments through a sign that insists on remaining even when everything seems lost. Miguel was not a weak man. He was a wounded father, a grieving son, someone who cried out for answers and received silence. And yet, It was in that silence that something began to move, not to punish, not to accuse, but to remind that the presence of God does not depend on our ability to believe. Since that day, Miguel has never been the same. He continues to work at the cemetery. He continues to deal with farewells, but now he understands that not every story ends underground. Some begin there. Whenever he passes in front of the old chapel, he stops. He leaves a flower. He says a simple prayer. He no longer asks for proof. He just gives thanks. Carmum keeps the blue rosary always close by, not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of the faithfulness that endured when everything was crumbling. And Sarah began to run, to laugh, to live again. She grew up knowing she was loved, cared for, and touched by something greater than she could comprehend. I share this testimony not to convince you of anything, but to walk alongside you for a few minutes. Perhaps you are also tired. Perhaps you are questioning. Perhaps you have discarded some inner rosary because you can no longer bear to wait. If that is the case, know this: you are not alone. Miracles do not belong to the past. They continue to happen, silently, discreetly, really, sometimes hidden where no one else looks. If this story touched you in some way, stay with us. Keep your heart open. Share this testimony with someone who needs to hear it. And if you can, take a moment today for a simple prayer, even if it is just a sigh. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Together, let's strengthen faith in God and the Virgin Mary. Because as I have learned along the way, when everything seems lost, that is exactly where the impossible finds space to happen. Thank you for listening to me today. I look forward to seeing you in the next testimony. May God always be with us. Amen.